Welcome to panel number, what are we now? Panel number three, the future of military operations. I'm Michael Mosser. I'm a fellow at the Strauss Center. And I'm very pleased to have with me up here I've got Janine Davidson, Dr. Janine Davidson, a professor at the School of Public Policy at George Mason University in Virginia, and Colonel and Dr. John Gentile, professor of military history at the United States Military Academy in West Point. The topic of discussion today is, are we in the new normal? What is the future of military operations? And essentially, it all stems from a series of recent speeches by Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who's the current Secretary of Defense, was the Secretary of Defense in the former administration as well. And he's made numerous speeches where he's spoken of the need to rethink and maybe reweight the balance of the elements of national power to get into what we're calling the comprehensive approach: economic development, reconstruction, improved governance, development of modern institutions. All these things coming together that formerly were the purview of other organizations may be now rolled into things that are military operations. Even the capstone Army Field Manual 3-0 is incorporated into Army doctrine, what the Army is calling the spectrum of conflict. It ranges from stable peace to general war and everything in between. And so the question that I'm going to start this particular panel with, and we are going to have an interesting discussion here for the next hour, I think, is exactly this. And I'm going to start with Colonel Gentile, if you don't mind. Is this, in fact, the new normal? Where on the spectrum of conflict do you see future military operations falling?
I think, thanks, Michael. And it's a pleasure to be here today, too, with Dr. Davidson as well, and nice to finally be able to meet her. I think, to answer the question, I do think that the preponderance of military operations for the United States Army is going to be small wars like Iraq and Afghanistan. I think there is a lesser but still very possible chance of conflict at the sort of the middle point of the spectrum. I mean, we're saying spectrum, we're going left to right, and left is some kind of very simple, perhaps peacekeeping type of intervention, and all the way to the right is the very highest end of conflict, state on state, perhaps between two states like the Soviet Union or Russia and the United States. So I think the preponderance of military operations will be of the small wars type, but there will also be some, I think, that range towards the middle or a little bit farther to the right. Potentially operations that might involve the United States in assisting South Korea if the North Korean state fails, and the occupation of the North Korean state by the South Korean Army, with some assistance by the United States Army and military that might involve some hefty fighting in pockets and forms of resistance of the North Korean Army. One can also imagine some kind of action needed to be done in Pakistan if that state fails to secure nuclear weapons. Those are very real possibilities, but not as great, I think, again, as small wars. And then a much less likely, but still possible, but admittedly much less likely possibility, again, is at the higher end of the fighting spectrum, and that might be in the form of a state-on-state conflict between the United States and Russia, hypothetically, over the Ukraine or somewhere like that. So that is where I see the future of conflict and military operations for the United States military, and specifically the United States Army as being at. Scholars, and one particularly, has formulated a sort of a construct for this way of thinking. Frank Hoffman has called these kinds of scenarios hybrid wars, where there's a combination of fighting from the lowest end all the way to the highest end. And I think that's a reasonable construct to use. The question, I think, and I imagine that Janine and I will probably share common ground in terms of how we see the future of conflict and the future of military operations. The question, though, it seems to me, based on where discussion and debate is now, is I think there would be general agreement on that. I mean, I don't know I don't know anyone who is saying, I mean, anyone who is reasonable is saying that there will be no more small wars of the future. We will only, you know, try to recreate the Soviet Union so that we can fight them in the Fulda Gap again. Nobody's saying that. Nor, on the other side, are folks like John Nagel saying that the future holds only small wars and we don't have to worry about fighting at the higher end of the conflict spectrum. So I think there's common ground there, but the question, I think, the rub then gets to, if that's an understanding of the future, how do you organize the American military? And then specifically for me and my interests, how do you organize the American Army to deal with that very uncertain future?
It's a nice lead-in. Janine, would you like to follow up?
Sure. Well, thank you for the invitation to come meet with you all today, and it is great to finally meet you face-to-face, John. There's not a lot of daylight between our two perspectives. I agree. I think when you think about what's the future conflict, you got to ask, what do you mean by future? As some of the Army leadership has been saying, you know, we really need to win the fights we're in, and those fights can be very protracted. If you understand how stability operations, nation building under fire, counterinsurgency, how that stuff works, by definition, it takes a long, long time. It's sort of one of those uncomfortable truths that we could be in Iraq as well as Afghanistan for 5, 10 more years.
100 years, maybe?
We could be there for a long time. Now, and this is where this is a very political decision. You know, it isn't about, you know, how do you define victory? I mean, that's part of it. It's about what do you want to leave there when you leave. And there are moral questions as well. People could have been very much against the initial invasion of Iraq, as I was, or against Afghanistan, like many people are. But now that we're there, that's sort of the inheritance that we have, and how to move on. So those are sort of political questions we can leave aside for now, but it's a reality that we're in. And the nature of the conflicts in both of those regions are, as Jean says, small wars, small meaning sort of the guerrilla war. And we can talk about what all that means in a minute. But I also think that in the future beyond those two theaters, we are going to see a lot more of this sort of weird, messy conflict. And why do I think that? Because we have a lot of weird, messy things going on in the world. We have climate change, which could put a lot of people on the run as refugees, and could also create scarcity in resources, which could lead to conflict. And it's usually civil internal conflict. We have an economic crisis, which we know can also lead to conflict. Now, a lot of these things tend to create a demand signal for the hegemon to do something. We have this sort of do-something syndrome. Some people, like Ralph Peters, might say these are all elective wars and we should just stay out of them anyway. And that's all very well and good unless you're the President of the United States. And we have another sort of issue in his political mindset, and that's there's a demand signal with the American people to do something sometimes. But there's also been, over I would say the last 20 years or so, evolving norms for human rights and human security, and a sense that the international community can and should intervene in some of these places where weak and failing states can't make it happen and meet the needs of their citizens. And again, this is a political decision, but it is, I think, a very real sort of demand signal for U.S. military and American involvement in general. So then that means the question for the American military and for the national security establishment as a whole is, you know, how do you do that stuff? For the military, it's definitely a question of how, because they don't necessarily get a say in the where and the why we intervene. They need to figure out the how. And when we talk about things like genocide, a lot of times when people think about genocide, they say, well, we need to think about it in a preventative way and blah, blah, blah. From the military perspective, I think American political culture will indicate, and history might demonstrate, that unfortunately, despite all the calls of experts that it's easier to prevent a genocide than to stop one in its tracks, we usually don't get called in until it's already underway. And so we don't really have any doctrine for that, you know? And people usually stop their analysis with, well, we don't want to have to send in the Marines. But, you know, I always ask, and then what, you know? Because that's tough. So I think we have a lot of reason to expect that the types of wars we're fighting now, as Secretary Gates says, are the types of conflicts that we'll be continuing to be in. And they are messy, and they are, I think Frank Hoffman's point about hybrid warfare is very much right on. And it is a very complex, multidisciplinary problem. Aaron Simpson actually wrote about it first, and so I give Frank the credit for capitalizing and marketing it, because it's I think it's a really helpful way to think about it, and we can get into that in the Q&A if people want to talk about what hybrid warfare is all about.
So that leads to a pretty obvious follow-on, I think, for John here. If the U.S. Army specifically is charged with fighting and winning the nation's wars, after all, if we don't have a sort of homeland defense and at the bottom of the, so if that's the mission of the U.S. Army there, does the trend towards counterinsurgency and stability operations, this sort of new normal that we just sort of agreed might be out there, these hybrid wars, how do we modify our force posture to one that was geared toward major combat operations, to one that's maybe geared more towards counterinsurgency or stability?
Yeah, right. I think just to build on what Janine said, I agree. This is the wars that we are in now have to receive our focus in terms of priority and training and all those kinds of things. There's no argument there. I also clearly agree with the notion of demand, and when the political masters tell the American military, you will go do nation building in Iraq or nation building in Afghanistan, then that is what we will do. I've been referred to by an analyst at the American Enterprise Institute. I think that's where he's at, Tom Donnelly.
Yeah.
He wrote a short little op-ed once and called me the Emory Upton of the new millennium. Familiar with who Emory Upton was? He was actually a great Civil War officer and did some really important things for the Army after the American Civil War. But Upton was of the mind that small wars like Indian fighting out on the frontier was not an important mission for the United States Army. Upton did not tell his political masters how to use the American military. What he believed, because he had spent some time in Prussia with a Prussian general staff, is that once the political masters put the Army into action, then it was the responsibility of the Army and the military to carry out those political objectives, and they shouldn't be interfered with by their political masters. I disagree with that. I mean, clearly there is interaction, which gets to my point here, and that is the demand is there, we're told to do it, yes, and we have to be ready to do it, which again gets at the question how best to organize to be able to do those kinds of things. But I do think that in the formulation of policy and strategy, the military has a very important role in advising and interacting with the political masters. So when the political masters say, go do nation building in country X for 10 years, then the military has to lay out and be involved with the development of a strategy and start to present hard choices and create sort of the atmosphere of prioritizing and understanding what it's going to take to be able to do that kind of effort. And the military has an important role in that. Now, to the question of a shift from a military, especially an American Army that had been trained and resourced and organized to fight conventional types of war towards counterinsurgency and stability operations, that shift is already well underway at least within the American Army. It's underway in terms of the intellectual climate within the American Army, and also it's underway in terms of the doctrine that the American Army has come up with, and also how the Army is going to shape its organization based on resourcing decisions like more infantry brigades instead of heavy armor brigades. So the Army is already well along that sort of glide path towards refocusing towards counterinsurgency and stability operations. I think the argument is somewhere around, is the Army going far enough? And then the worry by some who think that once we're done with Iraq and Afghanistan, the old conventional-minded bogeyman will come out and yank the Army back into its Cold War mindset so it can buy more tanks and big types of armored platforms like that. I don't see that. I mean, I think the Army is well on the way to a shifting towards counterinsurgency and stability operations. The question is have we gone far enough? Or have we actually maybe even gone too far to where we're not really thinking in important ways about the potential that we might have to fight somebody of significance in the future.
Janine, how's the F-22 for coin? I mean, are we
Well-
postured in a way that for their strategic services?
Actually, that's a really good question. We don't talk about that enough, I don't think. I can't talk about how many or whatever we should buy, but I can say that air superiority is a really important thing. And we in the United States, we've really been lulled into a lot of sense of security about air superiority. I mean, nobody else in the world, when you're in a conflict environment, when they hear aircraft overhead, feels comforted by that. We feel comforted by that, and there's a reason for that. We have ISR, we have unmanned vehicles. We have, when we're getting a bind on the ground, when the Army gets into a bind on the ground, or the Marines or anybody, they have that trump card of the post-air support that, despite all the, there are some controversies back and forth about who should own which airplanes and blah, 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 has a remarkable record for being there when you need it. And we really can't overemphasize how important that is. And so what the Air Force has done, it has underplayed how hard it is to get air superiority. It takes a lot of money, a lot of R&D. We take it for granted on the ground. But the day that we lose air superiority, the day that those planes can be shot down from the ground or shot down from the air, which is a lot further away than being shut down from the ground is the day our entire coin fight changes. Everything we do in coin, all our doctrine, all our training, all our education, presupposes that we have air superiority. And I really think we need to take a look at that. Now, if the Air Force says that the technology is such that we are however many years away from losing air superiority, we should pay attention to that. And they seem to think, and there's a great article in The Atlantic by Mark Bowden this week on this, that the F-22 is, that the F-16, the technology that is enabled in the F-16 is at risk of being obsolete. And so we should have that discussion. And because what I see from a lot of people in this discussion is a lot of sort of flippant, tribalism. Where the ground force is saying, the Air Force, all they want is sexy, fast toys, and the F-22 is their latest and greatest, and they want to modernize for modernization's sake. Okay, well, somewhere between that argument and you're not going to have air superiority anymore, we need to adjudicate. So that's a very good question. I appreciate you bringing it up.
Well, then, it's leads to yet another one of these follow-on questions, but this is more of a philosophical one. And we're talking now, because John brought this up in his discussion here about, the military speaking truth to power in many ways, but also in being part of this, as Clausewitz once said, sort of war is politics by other means, that there has to be a relationship between strategy and policy and between war fighting and the commander-in-chief. And so, in a democracy, with the people essentially at the base of this pyramid speaking through their representatives and up into the commander-in-chief, if we're in a war-fighting strategy, a future one that's geared towards coin, how do we communicate that through the democratic means to change expectations from this expectation of, okay, we win the big battle, Gulf War, OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom 1, we win these things in a 100-hour ground war. How do we shift that from fighting a wing of the nation's wars very well, best in the world, to one of the long slog, 5, 10, however many generational years?
Within the Army, Michael?
Within the Army,
right,
or speak to
right.
how, sort of whatever level you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, I'd prefer to speak to it within
Sure.
the Army. How that, how that question is applied and thought through in terms of the American people gets into a very complex issue of civil-military relations, the role of the military today, that it's a professional military, there's no longer a draft, the link between the two, and how that shapes, constrains, or affects presidential executive decision-making in terms of the application and the use of the American military over a long period of time. But specifically within the Army, I think that the Army has, after almost 7 years of fighting and operating in Iraq and Afghanistan, has figured out the nature of counterinsurgencies and irregular type wars. And certainly there was a mindset in the American Army prior to 2001 that the United States. This is what Russell Weigley, a very famous military historian, called the American way of war. The idea of the big war starts, you bring everything together, you go in, you fight it with massive amounts of firepower, you win decisively, and then the war is over and the boys and girls get to come home. That mindset was certainly there in the American Army prior to 2001, although it's not dominant, and it doesn't have sort of a controlling mechanism over the way the American Army thinks now. I think we're beyond that. I think we've figured out that when we do these kinds of military operations, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, that it is going to take a long time, and this is the nature of these kinds of wars. I also don't think that if there was a delta between sort of the mindset of the American Army going into especially Iraq, with this idea of a conventional, only want to fight the big war type mindset, that delta didn't last very long, and it didn't have a decisive effect on how the American Army performed in Iraq during the first 3 to 4 years of the war there.
This is a great question from a civil-military relations standpoint. I think John's right that the Army gets it. They know this stuff is hard, it takes a long time, it's messy. But we're talking about the civil-military dynamic of the decision to do this stuff to begin with. And Admiral Mullen and Gates have both said, we need to reach for other tools in our toolbox, and and Admiral Mullen in a recent speech at the Nixon Center was making a strategic point about, we as the military need to be able to tell our civilian leaders, we may not be the best tool here, and there are other options. I actually think he's right, but I also think that we need civilians who understand strategy. Elliot Cohen says that at that political strategic intersection, there should be an unequal dialogue, much how John was talking about, but that at the end of the day, the civilians have the trump. Presupposes that civilians understand, what it's going to take and everything else. How do they do that? Well, they need to understand what counterinsurgency is all about. There's a new handbook that Elliot Cohen actually just signed out at the State Department called the Counterinsurgency Handbook for Policymakers. And it's basically a really skinny book that says this stuff is hard, takes a long time. If you want to succeed, you should have these sorts of preconditions. If you don't have these preconditions, it's going to be even harder. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that the Congress needs to understand and the President needs to understand. So that is an education process. And I would say generationally, it can and should start in the school well before that, which is another reason for your conference here. So. I think that to the extent that these things are going to be hard and that some of them are elective, people need to understand how hard they are, not just the Army. The Army gets it. It's the people that are sending them over. Do they get it? And how,
Can I build
jump
on
in.
Janine said? Although I think with being within the Army, it's right. Professor Elliot Cohen, who's just done some fabulous work, very important for past administrations. The idea that civilians need to have an understanding of strategy formulation, all those kinds of things. But even though the Army gets it, I think the Army also potentially, if we're not careful, will revert back to its older self like it was before and I think we're seeing that still today, is the American Army has always been most comfortable with tactics and operations. And so I see this a lot where folks within the Army want to talk about tactical methods for stability, for counterinsurgency, for nation building. They want to talk about operational methods. But the American Army also needs to be able to get the formulation of strategy. And I think there's two gaps. There's the civilian gap, and there's also, if we're not careful, the gap with the Army. And that's the last thing that we want, because then we're going to end up like the Germans and the French and the British in World War I, where you had this huge gap between policy and the political, and then what was happening with operations and tactics.
I absolutely agree. I mean, both sides need to be sort of halfway in each other's space at the strategic level. If the military is actually confuses operational strategy with grand strategy, then we never get over to that other grand strategy side unless the civilians are thinking in those terms as well. I actually do think that we have seen a gap in that space where both sides are sort of doing the Huntington thing. Well, give us the political, your political objectives, and we will carry it out. But but the civilians will say, well, I'm listening to my commanders in the field. So which is it? I think we need to really dig deeper into that strategic gap on both sides, and that's another role for the academy.
Doesn't that force the country out of its comfort zone, though? Doesn't that get us down this road to
What's
this?
worse?
I mean, this is the big debate we've been having for the last 8 years. Are we a nation at war? Are we an army or a military at war? And those who come down on either side of this, especially those who say, no, we're only a military at war, sort of say to the country, you need to be more invested. Sort of the civilian population need to be, 1% of the American population is in the military. It's a very small, and it's sort of an active part, and it has an enormous impact and sort of disproportionate impact on policy. And yet, to get to sort of where we are talking about here, don't we require, especially in a counterinsurgency or a stability type future, don't we require the input of civilians
Absolutely.
Everywhere?
Yeah,
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, right. Definitely, and the purpose of the conference can help in that regard, especially about bringing the universities into this. But this also gets at the fundamental point brought out in an exceptionally important book that I read a couple of months ago by Andrew Bacevich called The Limits of Power. At the end of American exceptionalism, where he writes about, and we should be concerned about that in the democracy, about this separation between the professional military and the people. Now, sometimes almost the automatic response to that is, well, in order to link the two back together, we need the draft. And I agree with Bacevich. That's not necessarily what's needed here. What he argues for, and again, this is an issue of civil-military relations fundamentally, is a greater role with the people in the country, with the democratic process, and an appreciation for what has happened over the last 20 or 30 years and how foreign policy and military policy and the use of the American military has sort of developed within the executive branch, and then the role of Congress in what at least Bacevich argues, really not having a role of Congress as far as trying to influence and shape what the president is doing in terms of foreign policy and his military.
Or were you talking more about like expeditionary civilians and having civilians actually
There are
as
proposals.
well?
Yeah, there are
Okay.
proposals on the table. John Noggle, who you've already mentioned, is sort of famously put out there that we need, active
Civilian
response corps. I think he
Right.
called that's an actual army sort of unit. But we've got the civilian response corps proposal out there as well. So. This is kind of that was a bit more the direction I was going with the question, and then we'll roll into, after that question, sort of how we can, as a university and as a global policy institute, sort of prep if we've actually got one of these kind of things in place. But let's first talk about the concept in general.
Yeah, I can talk to that a little bit.
Please.
There is a sense that because counterinsurgency, stability operations, nation building, and all these things require non-kinetic activity, meaning non-enemy to enemy, force-on-force stuff, economics, governance. I would say that governance is the key line of operation for these things, trying to get these weak and failing states to be able to take care of the problem on their own. Because of that, you need non-military expertise. And what we end up doing is throwing the military at the problem because there's nobody else available to go, number one. Number two, even if they were available, it still might be kind of still too dangerous for them to be there. So this is a dilemma that we have. At the State Department, there's a new office, the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization. It's a fledgling place. But one of the things that they've been trying to do is create a civilian expeditionary corps. It has 3 levels. The first level, and very small, first level about 250 folks, will be full-time, all the time, ready, willing, and able to go to these environments and train to do so. And they have to do it with the support of the U.S. military. They can't go over there by themselves. And that makes perfect sense, unless we want to outsource everything in terms of security, which I don't necessarily think we want to do. The second level down are people that are in the government somewhere, that sign up to be sort of on call. And then they can go within a matter of days or weeks or months, and like the reserves kind of. And then the third layer, and they've already started those 2 layers. And then the third layer is another 2,000 folks that will come from, you could join. Anybody can sign up to be in this, this sort of reserve component. That part hasn't been funded at all by Congress, and it isn't really going anywhere yet. Now, in the Obama campaign platform, he was calling for, so that in total, the current one is something like 4,500 people total. The Obama platform was calling for 25,000 civilian reserve corps. That's a huge number, but slightly different, that they would be available for these sorts of messy overseas nation building and development things, as well as home crises like Katrina's and things like that. So you can sort of stay tuned to see if and how that takes off. So and then there are a lot of different layers. I mean, we can talk about this all day, but I'll just lay one more thing out there. The military really wants more civilians to help them do these sorts of things in the field, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. And the civilians, Secretary of State Clinton really wants the capacity to be built in the State Department and elsewhere across the government, Justice, Commerce, Treasury, and everywhere else. That's great. The challenge for the military will be, let's not be so sanguine about as soon as the civilians come, we don't have to do this stuff anymore. Right. You will still be there. You will be there with the civilians. You will be the enabling force. So the challenge is, and I just wrote about this recently, is to start thinking now for when they do show up, what do we mean when we say we're the enabling force? Precisely. Like, do they sleep on our fobs? Do we drive them around? What are all those? Probably. Because it's not in the taxpayer's interest to duplicate all those sorts of logistics. It's not in the taxpayer's interest to duplicate all the security functions, and it's not something that the military is just going to stay in their lane while the civilians do their things. So I think those are sort of the outlines of that civilian operational expeditionary thing as I see it.
John, is it a good idea to do it this way or no?
Well, we have, again, it gets to this, there is this broader civil-military problem of, what are we using the American military for? If we're committing it to do these sorts of things, how do we resource the military to do this? Can we get, the right amount of civilian capacity to support the military, in this case here, the American Army, to be able to do those things? That is a separate, higher, but still very much a related issue. The point Janine's making is right, but there is a delta there. So we can make these calls for, more civilians in this department and that department so that they can do these kinds of functions that civilians would ideally do, because civilians you have economic experts, agricultural experts, all those kinds of things. But there is a gap, there's a delta. And until we can close that gap, then those functions have to be done by the military. And herein lies a problem, and herein lies risk, in that so if the American military, take for example, or the American Army decides to build an advisory corps like John Nagel is calling for, those 30,000 some odd soldiers come from somewhere. If we have to produce more experts on economics, on agricultural types of problems, that expertise, that amount of time, that kind of training comes from somewhere. And where it's coming from today in the American Army is in its overall capacity to be able to do its more traditional, higher-end fighting competencies, like being able to fight. Like, here's an example. When I came in at around 10 o'clock, there was one of the panels on energy policy. And I was listening, it was very fascinating, and not knowing that much about it, but having done 2 runs in Iraq, the first time as a brigade combat team XO in Tikrit in 2003, and the second time in West Baghdad in 2006 as a cavalry squadron commander, the things that they were talking about were absolutely relevant. I mean, how do you try to build an economy and have an effective government policy towards energy and all these kinds of things? And I'm thinking, okay, as a relatively senior officer, what should I be focusing on now for myself? I mean, if I have to take the time to learn how to do these kinds of things, I'm not spending that time learning and training how to coordinate combat functions against an enemy who is fighting me. So the point here is that with this Delta and the military having to compensate, it does come from somewhere, and we are taking a certain amount of risk in these other sort of functions that the American Army needs to be able to perform.
So it is a bit of a zero sum. I agree. On the other hand, right now and for the foreseeable future, we need to win the fights we're in, and the Army's going to keep getting stuck with the Army and the Marine Corps. Even if and when the civilians show up, however, you may not have to develop the capability and capacity to conduct and do all this stuff. But in order to be the enabler that our doctrine says the military needs to be, we still are going to have an educational system that at least gives, the broad outline of what's happening on the ground, so that we aren't constantly arguing. And a lot of this is getting much better through experience, but not through necessarily education and training. That, if the aid representative wants to spend the money one way and the captain on the ground wants to spend it another way, well, who should win that argument? Probably the aid expert, but who ends up sometimes winning that argument? The guy with the checkbook, which ends up being the military. So these are some of the things we need to work out, especially as more and more civilians do show up. I still think we're going to have a baseline, continue to have baseline education in things like economic development under fire for the leaders, for the leadership in the military. Otherwise, they're not going to know how to support, and they're not going to understand the broader context of the complex conflicts that they're in. And it's zero sum. Going to learn a lot of stuff because this is messy.
Well, and that's actually where I'd like to end our part of this particular conference, and we'll open it up to questions. But I'd like to get your thoughts briefly on how do we operationalize this? How do we actually use universities and global institutes such as the Strauss Center, to make this, to accomplish this mission, this very important sort of national mission? John, please.
Yeah, I just quickly, I think as thinking through this question that the universities need to use their position of detachment, because one of the things that is interesting over the last 6 or 7 years, in that we've been doing these counterinsurgency stability types of operations, that by their nature, the tactics and the operational methods are not just military. They involve functions that civilians usually do. And so part of the academic community has been contributing to this. But in so contributing to this, they've also actually become part of the team, so to speak, and they've been bound up into it. So I think one of the things important for the universities to do is to have this space and to have this detachment and to be able to help us, the military, think really and deeply, critically about what we're doing, the operational methods that we're coming up with, and especially, I think, this gap that we talked about before in terms of strategy and policy, and having the universities help us sort of manage and compress and bring together those gaps.
That's great. Thank you. Janine, you've been involved in an organization, the Consortium for Complex Operations, that in some respects was set up specifically to deal with this question. I wonder if you might speak to that a bit. Absolutely.
I mean, I have lots of ideas for this, but I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll give you sort of my top 4. But the Consortium for Complex Ops, something set up by the government, DoD, state, USAID, to try to coordinate education and training among themselves, but then also to tap into this outside knowledge. We haven't really cracked that nut yet, and it's only been going for less than a year. So maybe this next phase, we can start to dig in on that. There are a couple things that I think just intellectually could help. Number one, I didn't serve in Iraq, but I went there on a sort of a fact-finding, lessons-learned trip in the summer of '06 when it was not only hot, but probably the most violent time, and I think you were there at the time too. And what I found was among the military and among civilians and between those two communities, all kinds of competing theories for how this stuff works. Is it jobs first, or is it, or do we have to, or is it security first? Is it, they're constantly arguing because we don't have sort of shared frameworks across the military and the civilians. And part of that is because we actually, as a community of practice and as a people, we don't exactly know how to do this stuff. It's not an exact science. And so I think rigorous political science, social science, anthropological, economic research on how to do economic development in a conflict environment. Because the core economic development models don't necessarily work when you're getting shot at. You may have to prioritize other things that you wouldn't do if you weren't getting shot at. And the economic development community is starting to recognize that. And so how do we do that? Same things with rule of law. You know, in Afghanistan, we went in and sort of set up like the top-level court system. Meanwhile, people on the ground weren't getting their disputes reconciled. So is it the local level stuff first or the top-level stuff, and how do we match those things? These are core theoretical things that I think that the academic community could really help with. Case studies. Case studies are great learning tools that can be used and also to shed light on those things. Dig really deeply on what is the civilian experience in the field. Is it really a good model to have them in there? Well, if so, how? You know, and let's get these people in and get their stories. Policy for counterinsurgency, educating the policymakers, you know, about the nature of conflict. Getting that debate out in the public is another thing that could really help, I think. And then finally, like what John said, putting the grand back in grand strategy. Really developing a cadre of civilians who get it, who understand national security again, and understand the civil-military relations and the role of America in the world, so that we can make better decisions and we can have a more coordinated effort abroad. So this is just 4 out of, I think I have 8 on my page. But so.
Well, that's exactly where I wanted to leave it. On this end, I appreciate the comments that you two have had. I think we should open it up for questions from the audience now. We've got about 15, I would say. Let's end it at 12:30, so we're the last thing standing between you and lunch. So, sir, if you don't mind.
It's interesting that you're talking about this nexus, especially in lower level conflicts. In one area where this is trying to be bridged, this connection between the civilian and the military, is in AFRICOM. And it hasn't gone necessarily very smoothly because there's been a lot of jealousies, a lot of turf battles between the civilian and the military, particularly on staffing, which was requested for AFRICOM. And there's also been an emphasis on phase 0. There's been diplomatic challenges as far as the African continent is concerned. And I was wondering if you could talk about that experience in relation to your discussions so far.
Sure. AFRICOM, for those of you who don't know, the military divides the world up into lots of different regions, EUCOM for Europe, PACOM for Pacific. And heretofore, Africa was mostly part of EUCOM, European theater. And there was a sense that, well, given the nature of the conflict today, like we described, weak and failing states and all this other messy stuff, maybe we should have, you know, a COCOM dedicated to Africa. And then, hey, as long as we're going to do that, why is it a military command? Why isn't it an integrated civil military command? And this gets to just the same problems I had when I set up the CCO. Turns out there is no such thing as the interagency. It's not a noun. It doesn't exist. Nobody funds it in Congress. Somebody has to host anything that's it has to be one or the other. And so this was the dilemma. So when AFRICOM is set up as a military command, but they wanted civilians to be a core part of their top-level command structure. So it runs into a couple problems, not the least of which is the fact that on the civilian side, their dance card is full. I mean, there just aren't enough civilians to go around for the demand signal that the military has. They want them in their schools, they want them on the ground, now they want them in their command signal, you know, and so it just gets really hard. I mean, I think it's probably the right way to go in terms of projecting American power abroad, but if it looks to the international community and especially the Africans in their regions like we're waging war, you know, even though we call it shaping, you know, it's a bad sort of strategic communications. So we need to get around that because on the flip side, there is a demand signal among people around the world for more engagement by the U.S. So, you know, as a hegemon, you can't really win. You're either not there when they want you there, or we're there and they don't want you there. So, I mean, I don't know if you have any perspective on that. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Alan.
Thanks. Alan Cooperman, I'm a professor here at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Thank you both for coming. I first want to thank you for praising and endorsing Elliot Cohen and his model of education of civilians on military affairs. I was a student of Elliot Cohen, and
Yay.
later lucky enough to be a colleague of his Society for Strategy and Policy, of course, which is development. And we try to do the same thing here at the LBJ School, of course, on military strategy. My question to you folks is about the grand strategy level. As you know, when we teach these courses, it's tactics, operations strategy, grand strategy. You both said there's some sort of gap on the grand strategy side. And I'd like to push you on that. Because it seems to me that there's a sort of feedback loop between the military and the civilians. The civilians, better or worse, say go into Iraq and Afghanistan. The military goes in, doesn't do a great job at the beginning, in my opinion, says we got to get good at this. So they put all the resources in. As you say, we've gotten a lot better at it. But once we're a lot better at it, then the civilians say, well, let's do some more of that. And then it just gets into the feedback loop. And Colonel Gentile, I guess in Italy we call Gentile, you were very even-handed here. In your writings, you've been a little, I think, stronger in saying that we've gone too far down this road to the left side of the spectrum and maybe downplaying the right side of the spectrum. If you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, you can say, yes, we got better, but on net, was it a good idea to go into these places? In Iraq, are we better off today than before we went in? I'd say not. After we knocked off the Taliban, from that point on, are we better off having gone in? And I would say, it's at least arguable, and you can make a very good case that the answer is no, that we're on net worse off. In which case, maybe this feedback loop of getting better and better and more is not actually good at the grand strategic level. So my question is, who's going to stop the madness? Who's going to come in and say, hey, wait a minute, let's think about this. Is this really in our national interest?
Well, I mean, the heart of that question is a matter of policy. And like Janine said, when the military is told to go in and do something, that is what we in the American military do. That is what the American people want us to do. We don't want an American military that's going to stand back and say no, right? Like my Air Force captain is. So we don't want it, but there is, and I should say, Elliot Cohen, I've never met him personally. I've had a number of very interesting and important email exchanges with him over the last 5 or 10 years. I first became exposed to Elliot Cohen when I was doing, I'd finished my doctoral dissertation on the World War II Strategic Bombing Survey, and in order to get it published into a book, I had to write a chapter on the Gulf War Air Power Survey, which Elliot Cohen ran. And I was just reading the emails back and forth between him and Wick Murray and Barry Watts, thoroughly impressed with the man. So I'm a big fan of Elliot Cohen. Just to comment quickly on the arguments that I have been making all along. I've always said, yes, we have to, if these are the wars we're told to fight in now, these are the wars we have to give all of our effort toward winning. However, again, back to trying to close this gap, I think in the American Army at least, we don't have the kind of discussions that we need in terms of strategy, of making hard choices. So if it says, well, we want you to, we want Afghanistan to look like this after 10 years, and the way it's going to look is somewhat similar to the way Chad looks now as a country, then we as a military have to say, this is what it's going to take. And maybe sometimes saying, we don't, based on the size force that we have right now and the capabilities that we have right now, we don't really have enough to do it. Or we say, yes, we have enough to do it, but we are facing a lot of risk in these other areas. And that's been the argument that I've been trying to make, is that in so prosecuting these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we have rightly so focused and become really consumed and become really only a counterinsurgency force in the American Army. My point is that that comes with risk. And we need to at least honestly assess and then present to our civilian masters the risks now that we think that we're facing.
Last word, Janine.
This is a great question. Well, actually, you had two questions. Was Iraq a good idea, and are we building too much and making it too easy to do more Iraqs? So, number one, my personal professional opinion is that Iraq wasn't a good idea. There's only one high-level officer that quit in protest, and that was General Newbold, who was who was the ops officer on the Joint Staff, and he basically said, he made a grand strategic argument and said, if you're going to disengage or down in Afghanistan in order to fight an elective war in Iraq, that's a bad mistake, and he was basically told, you're out of your lane. And he resigned in protest.
That is a grand strategic argument.
That's right.
It's like Germany first.
That's right. So then the other point is, if I'm Secretary of Defense, which I'm not, or Secretary of the Army, which I'm not, and I have to organize, train, and equip for stuff I think I'm most likely to do, it's not only insubordinate to build a military for stuff you want to do in order to tie the hands of your civilian masters. Okay, but the delicate point is you can do what we keep talking about, which is help the civilian masters, so to speak, understand what they're going to get themselves into, and in order to get to the point that you're making. So, I mean, you're skating on some dangerous ground there from a civil military perspective, but I feel your pain because Iraq is a messy business. But I will say that we did not go into Iraq because the Army was optimized to do coin. Right? I mean, isn't that the whole problem? That it wasn't optimized to do coin, or and it had to develop as it went, or whatever. You can make all those arguments, but it wasn't because we had the toolkit that made the policymakers stand up and say, "Ooh, neato, let's go find a place to do that." Okay. We can't confuse doctrine or force structure with grand strategy and policy. We had doctrine and force structure for nuclear warfare for a long, long time, but that didn't mean we were out looking for places to blow to smithereens, right? So, but, I mean, it's a great question because it encompasses all those civil military things and the massively difficult decisions that the military leadership has to make when they plan to and organize and train and equip for the future. So, thanks for that question.
All right. Well, with that, I want to thank both John and Janine for an outstanding hour. I think we had some really good discussion here. I want to thank you all for the questions and for your participation. Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Great to finally meet you, John.